In 1875, the Ottoman Empire stood as one of the world's great powers, controlling territories across 3 continents. Within 6 months, it would declare bankruptcy and lose financial sovereignty forever. In 265 AD, Roman citizens watched prices for basic goods skyrocket 1,000% in a single year. The greatest empire in human history had entered an economic death spiral from which it would never recover. These weren't isolated incidents of bad luck or incompetent leadership. They were the final stages of a pattern that has destroyed every dominant power in recorded history. Today, that same pattern is unfolding in real time across the global economy, and the warning signs are impossible to ignore. Economic historians have identified a specific sequence that precedes every major empire collapse. When 5 distinct triggers converge simultaneously, the result is not gradual decline but catastrophic implosion. This isn't theory or speculation, it's documented fact, repeated across millennia with mathematical precision. The first trigger is currency debasement, when governments systematically reduce the value of money to cover expenditures. The second is unsustainable debt accumulation, where public obligations far exceed any reasonable capacity to repay. The third trigger involves chronic trade deficits, as empires import far more than they export, hemorrhaging wealth to foreign powers. The fourth is military overextension, the exhaustion of resources maintaining far-flung territories and commitments. The fifth and final trigger is the loss of reserve currency status, the moment when the world stops accepting your money as the standard of value. When these 5 forces operate independently, empires can survive for decades or even centuries. But when they converge, when all 5 accelerate simultaneously, the timeline compresses from generations to years. The collapse doesn't build gradually, it detonates. And history shows us that once this convergence begins, no empire has ever found a way to reverse it. The Roman Empire provides the clearest blueprint of this pattern in action. Under Emperor Augustus, the silver denarius contained 95% pure silver and served as the monetary foundation for the greatest economic system the ancient world had ever seen. By 68 AD, Emperor Nero reduced the silver content to 90% to finance military campaigns and public spending. This was the first warning sign, a government beginning to devalue its currency to bridge the gap between revenue and expenditure. The debasement accelerated catastrophically during the 3rd century crisis. By 253 AD, the denarius contained just 36% silver. 15 years later, in 268 AD, it had plummeted to a mere 2.4%. This wasn't gradual inflation, this was monetary annihilation. By 265 AD, when the silver content had effectively vanished, prices across the Roman Empire exploded 1,000%. Citizens who had saved for decades in Roman currency watched their wealth evaporate in months. But currency debasement was only one trigger. Rome's debt burden became mathematically unsustainable as emperors borrowed heavily to finance both military campaigns and domestic spending programs. The empire maintained a massive trade deficit, importing luxury goods from India and China while producing increasingly little that foreign powers wanted to purchase. Military overextension drained resources. Rome maintained legions from Britain to Mesopotamia, defending borders that stretched beyond any reasonable capacity to protect. And finally, confidence in Roman currency collapsed internationally as foreign traders increasingly refused payment in debased denarii. The convergence point came in the mid-3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had 50 emperors in 49 years. The empire fractured into competing territories. Agricultural production collapsed as farmers abandoned worthless currency for barter. The tax base disintegrated because there was nothing left to tax. This wasn't decline, it was systemic failure. The Spanish Empire offers an equally instructive case study from a completely different era. In the 16th century, Spanish galleons brought unprecedented quantities of silver from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas. Between 1492 and 1810, the Spanish money supply increased more than tenfold measured in silver equivalent. Spain should have become the wealthiest nation on earth. Instead, it triggered the price revolution. Between 1500 and 1560, the average cost of goods in Spain doubled, an annual inflation rate of approximately 1.2%, which sounds modest by modern standards, but was economically devastating in a pre-industrial economy. The flood of silver didn't create prosperity, it created inflation that destroyed the purchasing power of Spanish currency. Foreign merchants raised prices when dealing with Spaniards because they knew Spanish silver was losing value. Spain simultaneously accumulated crushing debt from endless wars defending its global territories. The Spanish crown defaulted on its debts multiple times. In 1557, 1560, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, and 1647. These weren't isolated financial mistakes. They were the inevitable result of expenditures that exceeded revenue by orders of magnitude. Spain ran massive trade deficits because it imported manufactured goods from other European nations rather than developing its own industries. The military overextension was extraordinary. Spanish forces fought simultaneously in the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, and across the Americas. And Spanish silver, which once served as the de facto global currency, lost that privileged position as other nations increasingly refused to accept it at face value. By the 17th century, Spain had declined from the world's preeminent superpower to a second-tier European state. The speed of the collapse stunned contemporaries. The empire that controlled the largest flow of precious metals in human history couldn't pay its soldiers or service its debts. The Ottoman Empire's collapse in 1875 demonstrates how quickly the endgame arrives once all 5 triggers align. By 1875, the Ottoman public debt had reached 214.5 million British pounds. The empire's entire annual revenue was only 21.7 million pounds, meaning debt stood at nearly 10 times annual income. For comparison, the modern debt-to-income ratio of the United States in 2022 was around 7.8, and that's considered dangerously high. The Ottomans had debased their currency repeatedly throughout the 19th century to bridge budget shortfalls. They ran persistent trade deficits, importing European manufactured goods while failing to modernize their own economy. Military expenses consumed vast resources maintaining territories from the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula. And critically, Ottoman currency had lost any international confidence. European creditors would only lend in gold or British pounds, not in Ottoman money. In October 1875, the Ottoman government announced it could no longer service its debt obligations. The default was absolute. European creditors demanded direct control of Ottoman revenues. By December 1881, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a European-controlled organization, assumed control of the empire's tax collection. The OPDA was granted monopolies on salt and tobacco, control over taxes on stamps, alcohol, fishing, and silk. 2/3 of Ottoman state revenue went directly to European creditors. The Ottoman Empire had lost financial sovereignty, effectively ending 5 centuries of independence 37 years before the formal political dissolution in 1922. The pattern repeats with astonishing consistency. The British Empire after World War II offers a 20th century example. Britain's national debt in 1945 stood at 270% of GDP. The war had forced massive currency expansion and borrowing. Britain ran enormous trade deficits as its industrial base eroded. Military commitments across a global empire drained resources. In 1950, Britain spent 9% of GDP on defense compared to virtually zero in Germany. And most critically, the British pound lost its reserve currency status to the American dollar at the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. Britain's imperial decline accelerated with shocking speed. In 1946, Britain took a $3.75 billion emergency loan from America, equivalent to over £90 billion in 2024 terms. Independence movements across the empire gained unstoppable momentum because Britain could no longer afford the military costs of maintaining control. By 1970, the empire that had controlled a quarter of the world's population and landmass had been reduced to a mid-sized European nation. The United States in 2024 shows all 5 triggers operating simultaneously at unprecedented scale. The convergence is not hypothetical. It's measurable in real-time economic data. The question isn't whether the pattern exists, but how far along the timeline we've already traveled. The first trigger, currency debasement, accelerated dramatically during the COVID-19 pandemic. Between February 2020 and early 2022, the M2 money supply increased by approximately 40%. The Federal Reserve expanded the monetary base by over $4 trillion in less than 2 years. This represents the fastest peacetime monetary expansion in American history. While the United States no longer reduces silver content in coins, modern debasement operates through currency creation, expanding the supply of dollars, which dilutes the value of every existing dollar. The second trigger, unsustainable debt, has reached levels that would have been considered impossible a generation ago. As of 2024, total U.S. debt held by the public stands at 124% of GDP. The federal deficit in fiscal year 2024 reached $1.8 trillion, representing 6.4% of GDP, nearly double the 50-year average of 3.8%. The Congressional Budget Office projects debt will reach 116% of GDP by 2034 under current policy. These aren't projections based on worst-case scenarios. They're baseline forecasts, assuming no major crises. Critically, the debt service costs are accelerating even faster than the debt itself. Interest payments on the national debt now exceed $1 trillion annually, more than the United States spends on national defense. As interest rates have risen from near zero to over 5%, the cost of servicing existing debt has exploded. The federal government now faces a self-reinforcing cycle, borrowing to pay interest on previous borrowing, which generates additional interest obligations. The mathematics of compound interest make this trajectory unsustainable by definition. The third trigger, chronic trade deficits, continues unabated despite periodic political promises to address it. The United States recorded a goods trade deficit of $1.21 trillion in 2024, the largest in American history. The deficit with China alone exceeded $295 billion. For decades, the United States has imported far more than it exports, sending hundreds of billions of dollars overseas annually. These deficits accumulate. They represent wealth permanently transferred to other nations. The standard economic counterargument is that trade deficits don't matter if the United States receives capital inflows in return. But this argument collapses if foreign nations stop wanting to hold dollar-denominated assets. Every empire that ran sustained trade deficits eventually faced the same outcome. Trading partners accumulated so much of the empire's currency that they began to question why they should continue accepting it. Rome's trading partners eventually refused debased denarii. Spain's creditors demanded payment in something other than inflated Spanish silver. The pattern is invariant. The fourth trigger, military overextension, operates at a scale unprecedented in human history. The United States maintains over 750 military bases across more than 80 countries. U.S. military spending in 2024 totaled approximately $997 billion, more than the next 10 countries combined. This represents 3.4% of GDP and nearly 40% of global military expenditure. The United States has formal defense commitments to more than 50 nations through NATO and bilateral treaties. This global military presence generates enormous recurring costs that never appear in official war budgets. The United States pays for force projection, logistical support, base maintenance, and military personnel stationed in dozens of countries from Japan to Germany to Diego Garcia. These commitments are effectively permanent, withdrawal triggers, allied concerns, and regional instability. But financing this presence requires either sustained economic surpluses, which the United States doesn't have, or indefinite borrowing, which is mathematically unsustainable. History shows that empires maintain overextended military commitments until the moment they suddenly can't, and the retrenchment is never gradual. The fifth trigger, the erosion of reserve currency status, is the most critical and the least understood by the general public. Since the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, the US dollar has served as the world's primary reserve currency. Central banks worldwide hold dollars as reserves, international commodities are priced in dollars, and global trade is conducted predominantly in dollars. This status provides the United States with what economists call exorbitant privilege, the ability to borrow in its own currency at favorable rates and to run deficits that would be unsustainable for any other nation. But this privilege isn't guaranteed by law or treaty. It exists only as long as the world voluntarily chooses to hold dollars, and that voluntary confidence is eroding measurably. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from 70% 2 decades ago to approximately 58% today. Central banks worldwide are diversifying away from dollar holdings. China and Russia have substantially reduced their dollar reserves. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are actively developing alternative payment systems that bypass the dollar. Saudi Arabia, which since the 1970s agreed to price oil exclusively in dollars, creating the petrodollar system, has begun accepting yuan for oil transactions. Each of these developments individually seems incremental, but collectively they represent the early stages of a reserve currency transition. And history shows these transitions don't happen gradually over centuries. They accelerate suddenly once a tipping point is reached. The British pound lost reserve status to the dollar, not over generations, but within years during and after World War II. Once the world perceives a reserve currency as unstable or overextended, the loss of confidence feeds on itself. Reduced demand for dollars would increase interest rates on U.S. debt, forcing the government to borrow even more to service existing obligations, which further reduces confidence in the dollar, creating a death spiral. The convergence of these 5 triggers in 2024 is historically unprecedented in its scale. The United States faces a debt-to-GDP ratio comparable to World War II mobilization, but without the economic productive capacity that existed in 1945. The trade deficit runs larger than most nations' entire GDP. Military commitments span the globe far more extensively than Rome's legions or Britain's empire. The currency expansion of 2020 to 2022 exceeds the debasement velocity that destroyed multiple previous empires. And unlike Rome or Spain or the Ottomans, which lost reserve currency status to rising challengers, the United States faces a scenario where no single currency may replace the dollar. Instead, the world may fragment into competing monetary blocks, which would eliminate the exorbitant privilege entirely. The timeline remains uncertain. Rome took 3 centuries from the beginning of debasement under Nero to final collapse. Spain declined over 2 centuries. The Ottoman endgame took 5 decades. But the British Empire went from global dominance to mid-tier power in 25 years. The velocity of modern financial systems, with instantaneous global capital flows, algorithmic trading, and interconnected banking systems, suggests the timeline could compress even further. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated how quickly systemic failures can cascade through modern economies. A loss of confidence in U.S. debt or currency wouldn't unfold over decades. It could unfold over months. The historical pattern suggests 3 sequential phases once all 5 triggers converge. The first phase is mounting pressure, the period where all 5 forces operate simultaneously but haven't yet triggered a crisis. This phase can last years or even decades. The empire continues functioning normally from most citizens' perspective. Debt rises, deficits persist, military commitments continue, currency expands, and reserve status slowly erodes. Economists debate whether any of this matters. Politicians promise reforms that never materialize. The second phase is the confidence break, the moment when the financial markets or foreign creditors suddenly reassess their willingness to continue financing the empire's deficits. This break doesn't require any new policy failure. It simply requires enough participants to notice that the existing trajectory is unsustainable. Once confidence breaks, interest rates spike as creditors demand higher yields to compensate for perceived risk. This forces the government to borrow even more just to service existing debt, which accelerates the crisis. The currency falls on international markets as holders rush to exit positions. Capital flight begins as both domestic and international money seeks safer havens. The Ottoman default in 1875 exemplifies this phase. The empire had run unsustainable deficits for decades, but the confidence break happened suddenly when creditors simultaneously concluded that the Ottomans could never repay. At that moment, the empire lost all access to credit markets. The British Empire faced its confidence break in 1945-1946, when American creditors demanded Britain fundamentally restructure its economy and begin dismantling the empire as a condition of emergency loans. The third phase is systemic adjustment, the period when the empire's economic structure fundamentally reorganizes to match its reduced circumstances. This phase involves sharp declines in living standards as the empire can no longer sustain consumption levels that exceeded production. Military commitments are abandoned, not voluntarily, but because the resources to maintain them simply vanish. Government services contract dramatically as debt service consumes available revenue. The currency loses substantial value either through hyperinflation or dramatic devaluation. For the former hegemon, this adjustment often takes a generation or more as the economy restructures around a lower equilibrium. For the broader global system, the implications of a reserve currency collapse are difficult to overstate. The US dollar currently underpins approximately 60% of global trade and central bank reserves. Trillions of dollars in contracts, debt instruments, and financial products denominated in dollars exist across every country. A rapid loss of dollar confidence wouldn't merely affect Americans. It would trigger a global financial crisis as institutions worldwide holding dollar-denominated assets faced massive losses. The 2008 financial crisis, which caused $2 trillion in losses and took years to resolve, would pale in comparison to a reserve currency crisis affecting $20+ trillion in global dollar holdings. International trade would fragment as nations scramble to establish alternative payment systems. Global supply chains dependent on dollar financing would seize up. Emerging markets that borrowed in dollars but earn revenue in local currencies would face defaults they cannot avoid. The interconnection of the modern financial system, often praised as creating stability, would accelerate contagion as failures cascade through the network. The geopolitical implications extend beyond economics. American global influence has rested substantially on dollar dominance and the ability to finance a global military presence through deficit spending. The loss of reserve currency status would force a dramatic reduction in overseas military commitments, not because of any strategic decision, but because of simple financial impossibility. The world order established after World War II, maintained through American economic and military predominance, would end. What replaces it remains uncertain. Historical precedents suggest extended periods of instability and competition as multiple powers vie for regional dominance without any clear global hegemon. The standard narrative about empire decline focuses on moral decay, political corruption, or cultural weakness. Conservative historians blame the abandonment of traditional values. Progressive historians point to inequality and social injustice. But the economic data reveals a more uncomfortable truth. Empires don't fall because they become wicked or lazy or corrupt. They fall because they attempt to sustain economic commitments that exceed their productive capacity, and they use monetary manipulation to paper over the gap until mathematics makes continuation impossible. Rome's soldiers didn't suddenly become cowards. Spanish conquistadors remained formidable fighters. Ottoman administrators weren't less competent in 1875 than in 1575. British citizens in 1945 had just won the largest war in human history. None of these empires collapsed because their people lost virtue or work ethic. They collapsed because the 5 triggers converged, and no amount of determination or courage changes what happens when an empire runs out of ways to finance itself. The contrarian insight that emerges from this pattern is perhaps the most challenging. Empire collapse isn't primarily a political or military phenomenon. It's an accounting problem. When debt service exceeds the productive capacity to generate revenue, when military commitments drain more resources than the empire produces, when currency debasement destroys confidence faster than economic growth can restore it, when trade deficits hemorrhage wealth abroad, and when reserve currency status evaporates, the mathematics become inexorable. No policy brilliance, no technological innovation, no surge of patriotism changes the fundamental arithmetic. This doesn't mean collapse is inevitable or immediate. The timeline remains uncertain. Rome managed several centuries between the start of debasement and final collapse. But the timeline compresses as the velocity of financial systems increases, and every case study in history shows the same pattern. The longer an empire delays confronting these imbalances, the more severe the ultimate adjustment becomes. Gradual policy changes in the early stages might allow decades of continued prosperity. But once all 5 triggers reach advanced stages simultaneously, the window for graceful adjustment closes. The historical pattern suggests we face a choice, though perhaps we've already missed the opportunity to choose. Empires either address these imbalances deliberately, reducing debt, eliminating deficits, restructuring military commitments, restoring currency stability, and accepting reduced international influence, or the imbalances resolve themselves through crisis. The first option is politically agonizing, but economically survivable. The second option is politically unavoidable, but economically catastrophic. Every empire in history has faced this choice. None has chosen the first option. And the 5-trigger convergence pattern has never failed to produce collapse. The question isn't whether these patterns are real. The historical evidence is overwhelming. The question is whether any society, knowing the pattern exists, can summon the political will to deviate from it before the mathematics make that choice for them.